So my conception of it has shifted. I mean, before I joined the academy, I used to be a research and campaign director for a national nonprofit called Free Press. And we thought a lot about the kind of information that folks would get and being able to treat that in itself critically. The kind of work I do now, I do a lot of work in teaching in the political economy of surveillance and more. And so many of the things we call media these days are actually increasingly things that take little bits from us that have been incorporated more and more into all aspects of our life, including our working life, where at my own school, we're starting to use Salesforce, a customer relationship management software to arrange professor schedules. There's all sorts of little bits and pieces of implicit information you can take from that. If you're a professor, all of a sudden it could be, we know how many emails you opened or not. We can create little metrics and new proxies for performance levels or more. And this is something you're seeing in higher education itself. So critical media literacy now is about much more than having a critical take and understanding on the information you're receiving so that you can discern what is trustworthy or not trustworthy or actionable or non-actionable. Now it's about understanding what you're consuming, using, doing, and how that could actually affect you materially in your daily life. Like, some choice you made to go to one particular location over another, have that data correlated with something else, might that relate to you not being able to get a favorable mortgage, in 15 years? So critical media literacy is actually it is still about discerning, is a source trustworthy? Is it misinformation? What is misinformation? Can the notion of misinformation be weaponized to, in fact, to push you in a direction that is favorable? And if you're trying to be sold a war, right? Don't believe this; it's misinformation. It comes from over here. Having a critical apparatus to determine, what you should be basing your opinions on. But now it's even understanding when and where you're interacting with these systems, understanding how these broader systems are in turn creating ways in which you are being measured, and this sort of separate data double that marketers like to talk about which decisions are being made. And the decision isn't being made as a result of considering you. It's about these little bits that have been pulled out about you. And that's what people are basing their in organizations, and governments are going to start making decisions about you about. Having this kind of holistic understanding of your relationship to those emerging systems is what critical media pedagogy to me now means. Any number of people and groups I've been involved with over the course of my life, it's, you're 100% in support of, I teach journalists. My students want to become journalists because they want to do the kind of work that will lead to some just end. Like, you become a journalist not because you want to just read the police blotter and report that, but you're doing it because you imagine yourself as Woodward and Bernstein, or or someone doing an even bigger scoop. You watch Citizen 4, and it's like, imagine if I could accomplish something like that. It's what my students are going to be facing when they go out into the workforce are these broader structures within which journalism now happens. The kind of training a journalist needs to do, where it's understood. On the one hand, it's wonderful that you're learning learning to podcast, learning to use all these new technologies to kind of to augment the reporting skills that you're trying to grow. But the political economic reason why you're being trained in all those methods is because news organizations, particularly of the corporate variety, are demanding you're not just going to report, you're going to repurpose. So it's a a labor and productivity issue, kind of a work speed up in an implicit sense. So on the one hand, there are these pressures that stem from we're going to have you do more and more of these other things and less reporting on the side, particularly in the corporate side. And there's also just the implicit pressures that folks, the old critiques from the 80s and 90s of corporate journalism, that the very advertiser pressure, pressure from governments on large newspapers and media outlets themselves create certain biases in what an editor might allow through or a publisher might allow through, which limits, of course, the range of reporting. Stuff we're seeing already. I mean, this is, these old critiques are coming right back to the fore as we examine what's happening in the Middle East, right now. So, back in the 90s and early 2000s, you stressed independent journalism because most of us felt that independent journalism was where particularly news and information coming from a particularly left perspective, that was the only way that was really going to out, right? And I suppose, in fact, past winners of the Dallas Smythe Award at this conference, at the Union for Democratic Communications Conference, John Downing, warned everyone, in the 90s and early 2000s that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The right wing's going to figure this out too. And one of the things we're now trying to tangle with is the very argument about the ability of a journalist to act within a corporate environment to do the kind of reporting that leads to truth about these systems. It's interesting that a lot of these same arguments are now being made from the political right that have very different objectives than all of us who got involved in this in the first place, because we were concerned that the kind of anti-war voices, coming from the left, kind of the critiques of commercialism and such coming from the left, were not getting, even an opportunity in a commercial environment. So there's kind of critiques of our critiques and blind spots in our critiques now that we all have to think about, and that's what's exciting about this whole field. As one of my advisors used to say, it's pretty much the same questions being asked over and over, but the answers change, right? So, I think the stakes of these questions, they were always high, but they're especially high now. There was, I remember one of the things that really stuck with me that Naomi Klein said, maybe 2 decades ago, was that one of the worst things that commercial journalism tends not to do is to not report on movement successes, particularly from the left. You don't hear about movement successes. You hear about things that change but aren't necessarily, the actual contextualization of it doesn't say this happened because people got together, decided we needed to move a system in this direction, and it worked, it changed, because that kind of thing doesn't get out. It's not just good news for good news. It's very different than that, right? But because there's a disempowerment element to campaign reporting when the reporting you're getting, which generates ratings and clicks, and newsrooms across the country are incorporating, essentially award boards. Up here, how many clicks did an article get? Is this thing being shared across social media? When you start to produce coverage that is geared toward that as your metric of success, horse races, all the things we critiqued in the 90s and 2000s, these things intensify. You get horse race coverage that doesn't really tell you much of anything, right? We're going to cover the polls, and the polls don't really tell you much of anything. Let me tell you what. You can extrapolate some things, but as we saw, polls don't necessarily reveal all that much about what's actually going to happen. So, when it comes to campaign coverage, if you even get it. I remember when in the middle of my graduate school career. I remember the University of Southern California doing a study of just how much coverage even happened of congressional races in California in the month leading up to a national election, right? You tally up how many minutes per half hour of local news you actually got some coverage of the congressional race for the U.S. House. And I sort of made a bet with my students. How many minutes do you think happened on average every half hour? And they're all very optimistic. They all start guessing something like 3 minutes, and then I try to bring them down. They're like, oh, it's got to be more than a minute and a half. And then then you finally get to crush their souls entirely by saying it's like less than 2 seconds, per half hour. So you beat them down to bring them back up after that. So one, like a lot of the decisions that we're going to make in that election, you're not even going to find information about it aboard the channels that, for whatever reason, are still in polls treated as the most trusted. Like local news remains one of those sources. Who knows why is most trusted. I'm in one of those schools where folks are being trained to go into local news, and we talk about this, and I kind of just put out there, I'm hoping you're the generation that fixes this, right? So you certainly could do this. So yeah, I mean, if anything, on the one hand, I would hope that a media system provides you enough information to actually make a reasoned decision when you're going into the voting booth, but that's the least of it. What I actually want is a media system that doesn't just give me that. It's a media system that actually is thinking about systems, and that's exactly the opposite kind of thing that corporate media does and has done for decades. The critique we have had of that, for decades continues to hold true. It is about, there's certain things that are favored in this coverage, but actual, coverage of movements and implications for systems, we've had to piece that all together ourselves on the outside with what resources we've been able to pull together, which is why independent media was always something we were seeking policies to subsidize, more and more outlets to utilize, and solidarity to build, right? So yeah, elections are one thing. Solidarity building, that's what I want, right?